1944, Europe lay in chains. Nazi banners stretched from the shores of France to the heart of Poland, and the sound of marching boots echoed across a continent suffocated by tyranny. Britain stood alone in the West, scarred yet unbroken, while the Soviet Union bled rivers of sacrifice in the East. Across the Atlantic, America's factories thundered with steel and fire, preparing to send men into a war that would shape destiny itself. The world seemed frozen in suspense, waiting for a single moment that could turn despair into hope. The Allies knew that, without opening a second front, victory might slip beyond reach. The Soviets demanded relief, the British longed for liberation, and the Americans pressed for action. Yet the price would be immense. Hitler's Atlantic Wall loomed over Europe's western coast, miles of bunkers, mines, artillery, and machine gun nests waiting for an assault. To pierce it meant unleashing thousands of men into fire and fury. Still, there was no turning back. Every day the invasion was delayed. More lives vanished under occupation. More resistance fighters fell in silence. And more nations tightened under Nazi grip. A decision had been made. The storm would break, and when it did, the world would never be the same again. Choosing where to land was the greatest gamble of the war. The French coast stretched for hundreds of miles, each point heavily defended, each decision carrying the weight of millions of lives. The Allies studied tides, terrain, and weather, searching for the one opening that could lead to victory. The port of Calais seemed the obvious target. It was closest to Britain, heavily fortified and expected by the Germans. But sometimes, to win, you must strike where no one believes you will. The decision was Normandy. Its beaches were less fortified than Calais, yet they were far from safe. Strong currents, treacherous tides, and endless stretches of open sand meant soldiers would be exposed to the enemy with little cover. It was a battlefield designed by nature to test human courage. To make matters worse, every calculation depended on a single day of favorable weather, one chance where sea, sky, and strategy would align. It was a choice that carried no guarantees. Success meant opening the road to liberation. Failure meant disaster on a scale too great to imagine. Still, the commanders believed the risk had to be taken. Normandy would become the stage upon which the fate of the free world would be decided. To storm the beaches, the Allies needed more than strength. They needed secrecy, surprise, and a trick grand enough to fool the enemy. Thus was born Operation Fortitude, one of the greatest deception campaigns in military history. Phantom armies were created from thin air, complete with inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, and endless streams of false radio chatter. The Germans watched with growing certainty that the invasion would come at Calais, never suspecting the true storm gathering elsewhere. Double agents fed Hitler's commanders with carefully woven lies. Photographs, reports, and whispers painted an illusion of strength where none existed. Even General Patton, one of America's most famous generals, was placed at the head of this phantom force to make the deception unshakable. Every move, every signal was part of a performance designed to keep German eyes fixed on the wrong shore. And it worked. When the Allies prepared to strike Normandy, German commanders still clung to the belief that Calais was the real prize. Even as the first waves of soldiers crossed the Channel, many within Hitler's high command hesitated, convinced the invasion of Normandy was nothing but a diversion. In that hesitation, destiny tilted. On the eve of the invasion, silence hung heavy across the Allied camps. Thousands of young men, from villages, towns, and cities across the world, sat in the quiet, their gear packed, their orders sealed. Letters were written under dim lights, messages to mothers, wives, children, and sweethearts, words that carried the weight of final goodbyes. Some prayed, some sang softly, while others stared into the darkness, knowing that within hours, the sea would carry them toward destiny. Commanders walked among the ranks, offering brief nods and words of steel. The air was tense with uncertainty, for every man knew the dangers ahead. The beaches they would face were no ordinary shores. They were traps of wire, mines, and hidden guns. Even the sea itself seemed restless, waves crashing like warnings of what awaited. Every soldier carried both the fear of death and the hope of liberation, bound together in a silence too heavy to break. Then came the word. The order was given. Engines roared to life, ships assembled in the black waters, and a vast armada stretched farther than the eye could see. The waiting storm had been unleashed, and history itself was about to awaken. The crossing of the English Channel was a journey through darkness and uncertainty. Over 50 ships of every size, battleships, destroyers, landing craft, set sail into rough seas, carrying the weight of the largest invasion force ever assembled. Above them, aircraft thundered through the night, while beneath the waves, submarines prowled, each vessel playing its part in the grand gamble of war. The sea became a highway of courage, stretching from Britain to France. For the men packed tightly into landing craft, the hours crawled by in silence. Rain lashed against steel, waves slammed into hulls, and seasickness churned already anxious stomachs. Some clutched rosaries, others their rifles, as the black horizon slowly revealed the faint glow of France. The closer they came, the louder the thunder of distant guns, echoing across the water like an omen. It was a crossing through fear itself. Yet, shoulder to shoulder, they pressed on. Ahead lay the beaches of Normandy, where fate would judge them. Behind lay home, families, and lives they might never see again. Through fire and water, they sailed toward the dawn of June 6, 1944. As the first light crept across the horizon, shadows descended from the skies. Thousands of paratroopers leapt into the darkness hours before the beach landings, drifting silently over enemy territory. Many were scattered, landing in fields, forests, and rivers. Far from their intended zones, confusion reigned. Yet their mission was vital to disrupt, to confuse, and to cut the enemy's lines before the main assault began. Across the fields of Normandy, church bells tolled and dogs barked as the land itself seemed startled awake. Small groups of soldiers fought in isolation, blowing bridges, silencing outposts, and striking with sudden ferocity. They were ghosts in the night, spread thin yet unyielding, their courage buying precious moments for the invasion force still at sea. By dawn, the beaches loomed ahead, and the first wave of landing craft prepared to crash against the sand. Soldiers gripped their rifles tighter, their eyes fixed on the distant shore. The longest day had begun, and with it, the turning of history's tide. The morning tide carried them into fire. As landing ramps dropped, soldiers stepped into churning waves, some sinking beneath the weight of their gear, others charging forward across open sand. The beaches of Normandy erupted with smoke and thunder, the air filled with the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles from hidden cliffs. It was chaos, raw and merciless, where survival depended on courage measured in seconds. Yet, amidst the storm, determination burned brighter than fear. Men crawled through surf, clawed over obstacles, and pressed forward inch by inch. Medics risked everything to drag the wounded to cover, while engineers fought to clear paths through wire and mines. Every step cost dearly, but each step brought them closer to breaking through the wall of steel that barred Europe's freedom. By sheer will, the impossible began to shift. Positions were seized, strongholds were silenced, and footholds carved into the blood-soaked sand. The beaches of destiny were no longer just a battlefield. They had become the threshold of liberation. As the day stretched on, the tide of battle turned. Reinforcements poured ashore, armor rumbled onto the beaches, and the weight of Allied strength pressed deeper into occupied France. What began as a desperate struggle for survival transformed into a relentless push forward. The Atlantic Wall, once deemed unbreakable, now bore cracks that spread wider with each hour. German commanders hesitated, trapped by deception and cut off by disrupted communications. Their reserves, held back for the phantom threat at Calais, never arrived in time to throw the invaders back into the sea. The hesitation that morning became the fatal flaw of the Reich, a delay that cost them the chance to seal the beaches forever. By nightfall, the Allies had done what many thought impossible. They had not only landed, they had endured, held, and begun to advance. Normandy was no longer a fortress, it was a gateway. And through that gateway, the liberation of Europe had begun. June 6, 1944 became more than a date. It became a symbol of sacrifice, unity, and unshakable resolve. Thousands never left the beaches, their stories buried in the sands of Normandy. Yet their courage carved the path to freedom for millions. It was a day where ordinary men became legends, where nations stood as one, and where the tide of history turned against tyranny. The victory at Normandy was not the end, but the beginning of the end. From that beachhead, the Allies advanced across France, through Belgium, and toward the very heart of Germany. The cost was staggering, yet the dream of liberation carried them forward. Each step traced back to that morning when the storm broke upon the shores and the world dared to hope again. History remembers the strategies, the generals, and the victories, but the true story of D-Day lies in the silent courage of those who never made it back. They were not fighting for glory, nor for conquest. They fought for a chance at freedom, for a world that could breathe again. So now the question is yours. Was D-Day the result of flawless planning? Or was it the unbreakable spirit of ordinary men that turned the tide of history? Share your thoughts below, because the battlefield is not just in the past, it lives on in how we remember it today. This is Battlefield Reborn, where legends are reborn. Subscribe, share, and let the world know the truth. The battlefield lives on, and the legends will rise again.